Burke than Paine on this, but anyway.
Well, you know, I think there's got to be. I mean, one of the conclusions that I come to in the book is that you've got to have you really to be. I mean, a lot of the book at the beginning is about Burke and Paine, and my wife is here, and she encouraged me to cut that bit down quite a lot, but she didn't entirely succeed. And my children agreed with her. It's been a kind of obsession of mine for about 20 years.
Well, if they buy the book, they'll see that.
They'll see that that's an obsession. But actually, the more I try to explain it to people, you know, when you think about what Tom Paine stood for, I mean, he was this guy, this British immigrant who came to the United States in 1773 and says, you know, okay, this is a great revolution. And he becomes, in 2 years, he becomes the spokesman for the revolution. He becomes the revolutionary writer. And he produces a book, Common Sense, which was the best, next to the Bible, the best-selling book in the English language when he wrote it. And it was the expression about the American Revolution. If you listen to every inaugural address by an American president, they always quote Thomas Paine. You know, the world is born anew, da, 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 da. This is the time that tries men's souls. All the phrases that he uses over and over again. And Burke's big point is, hang on, think of the consequences. Just think through what's going to happen. This world is not born anew. We get up in the morning, we know the institutions, nothing changes, everything is the same, and think through what are the consequences of what is going on. Pretty good message both ways.
It makes a fine structure for the book. And
Thank you.
You know, some people in reviews have said it's challenging. In fact, I found it quite intriguing. But let's move from that century to this one in Canada. And I think Canadians have been obviously very moved by what they've seen across the Middle East and the bravery of people willing to literally put their lives on the line for the dream of democracy. Here in Canada, we seem to take our democracy for granted, and you know, there's been a lot of talk in the last couple of years in writing about the erosion of our democracy, particularly in Ottawa, where we see a lot of. I mean, this wasn't done just by the Harper government; it's part of a continuum, but a concentration of power, control of the message. You know, a great deal of loss of democracy, and I think the question begins: do we care enough? Are we informed enough about our federalism and our democracy, and are we willing to defend it with any kind of passion, even vaguely like that which we're seeing unfolding in the Middle East?
Well, that's good, because my next book is called Importing Democracy. So it's
a straight line. We set that up. Very good.
No, I think it's and again, one of the criticisms of the book from a number of my colleagues is that it's not sufficiently partisan. Yeah. That it's it doesn't sort of it's not a diatribe against Stephen Harper or whatever.
It's more deaf night work. There's little moments in there where you get the shiv.
Little bit. But I do think that there is we do have a real problem in Canada and in the West generally with the nature and quality of our democratic life. It's a real problem. Yeah. And I think we've become incredibly complacent about it, and nobody really seems to me, what to do about it, except that the people are, in a sense, voting with their feet. Yeah. We used to have 75% participation in the federal election. We now have, the last election, we had less than 60%, so we're now down to 58%. In my riding, I think in Toronto Centre, where we just happen to be, I'd say that to those of you who are still from Toronto Centre, because there might be an election in May, I just want to sort of just take advantage of that moment. We had 62% participation.
And many of those voters look much like the demographic of this room.
And in the south,
not young people.
And in the south end of the riding, which has very mixed income, the numbers would be even lower, 55–50% turnout. So people are less engaged. It's particularly a challenge with younger people who are less engaged politically in the formal sense. So that's one thing we have to think about. And the other thing is that based on the fact that I've been a a rising star in 5 political decades, you know, so I have
sort of plateaued
so I have sort of,
recently,
yeah, plateaued. I've hit some kind of a glass ceiling. I don't know what it's called. I've reached the you're looking really well sort of stage of my political life. There is a corrosiveness to public life today that there didn't used to be. I mean, I shouldn't say there didn't used to be. The Pearson-Diefenbaker period was very tough and was unpleasant in the House of Commons, and it was difficult. And you know, but you know, when I first went into the House of Commons, which is over 30 years ago, anybody counting, it was a different atmosphere. Conservatives and NDP and Liberal, people would talk, we'd chat. You go out for dinner, you became very good friends. I mean, I had many, many good friends on the Conservative side who remain friends to this day. Same thing with, you know, obviously I was that time, as people know, in the NDP and Liberals. And there was a lot of chatter, background talk. There's much less of that today. It's much harder to reach across the floor and have a kind of a conversation with the other side. It's much harder to convince people that you don't have, you know, you don't have horns and you don't have some other agenda. You're going to just talk about something. And there's been a whole culture as well in question period in which people don't ask questions spontaneously. They don't answer them spontaneously. It becomes much more of a set piece. And I feel like I'm kind of like in another movie because I don't play the game that way. I mean, like, I don't do interviews that way. Somebody said to me, "Well, do you go into an interview? Do you have your talking points?" I don't have any talking points. I'm just answering your questions. I don't come out with a series of lines, you know, and say this is, you know, I don't.
Getting you to talk is not a problem.
Not a problem. But it's getting me to stop talking. Maybe the point is to stop. But it's a very different culture, and you've got this centralized spin cycle, which is just unbelievable, which is connected to the 24-hour news cycle. But we do have this spin cycle. I mean, you cannot. I don't know if anybody still watches Question Period, but if you ever watch Question Period, I can't imagine why anybody would watch Question Period. But if you do watch it, you can see there's talk lines. There's talk lines on one side and there's talk lines on the other side. And people are just basically throwing the ball back and forth. And somebody will get up and ask a question, and they'll say, well, you know, you're tired and old anyway, or why would I answer your question? And sit down and say, that's it. Well, you know, it's.
You say nevertheless.
It's true. Nevertheless, here's my supplementary. And the criticism of the opposition would be, well, minister will answer a question, and then you've got your prepared supplementary question, and you'll ask the same question over again, and he'll say, I just answered your question. Like, were you listening to what I was saying? The answer is no, I actually wasn't listening to what you were saying. And that's a problem. I mean, there's a real problem with that aspect of it. And you mentioned it, the centralized power structure. We used to have very strong cabinet ministers. We used to be in the Pearson government, Saint Laurent governments, you go back. You'd have ministers who'd run departments, and they'd run them. You know, I mean, these guys, I mean, you know, Margaret Trudeau's father, Jimmy Sinclair, ran the Department of Fisheries.
Right.
And he ran it. And nobody touched him. I mean, today, a minister can't move without getting his talking points from some 25-year-old.
Don't have any particular political
jihadist
base of
from
their
the
own
prime
that
minister's
makes them
office.
powerful.
No, you got these 25-year-old jihadis in black suits, and they say, here, minister, this is what you're saying. And in the case of foreign policy, ambassadors will tell you they're not allowed to say anything.
Completely mute.
They can't. I mean, they can't brief a reporter off the record without having their talking points approved by the Prime Minister's office. But I mean, it's crazy.
Having watched this, and I must admit, I sort of bought in, if you will, into Paul Martin's promise to slash the Democratic deficit. But it strikes me now that what happens is that in opposition, people have great democratic principles, but when they get into power, what the driving force is what matters is what works. And so they just say, look, the first thing that Paul Martin did, or this first budget, instead of moving to strengthen Parliament, he moved to strengthen the PMO. And I mean, you follow the dollars.